So we've heard from all the speakers today. We won't introduce them all again, but we have two folks who are very interested in the topic and contributed a lot to the thinking behind this session. And we'd like to ask Caroline Robertson maybe to start with a short self-introduction.
Sure, just very briefly, I am a neuroscientist also based here at Harvard. So I'm based here at Harvard in the Society of Fellows, and my research focuses on understanding the neurobiology of autism, which is predictable because I actually did my PhD studying under Simon in Cambridge. So the way that I link back to the talks that we were hearing today in this session is that my work specifically focuses on sensory sensitivities and differences that people with autism have, and I mostly study visual perception. And I use some of the paradigms that I'm working with right now are providing the first measurements of GABA in the brains of people with autism and linking that molecule to these sensory sensitivities. So again, my work is very directly motivated by the elegant empirical work done in Takau's lab over the years with mouse models of autism. And we're working now to try to link these neural circuitry theories to differences in the human brain that might be causing symptoms in people.
Can I ask a quick question? Is that using magnetic resonance spectroscopy?
Yes.
Is that MRS?
So it's an MR technique in a typical MRI machine.
Are you measuring glutamate as well?
Yes.
Ah, yes.
Well, I just have a quick question. Are you finding a correlation? Yeah, that's a good idea.
Yes.
GABA. Okay, got it.
Yes, and GABA selectively and not glutamate. So
Okay.
that's the basic finding at the moment.
Sure.
Okay, I'm Ella. I'm working on brain plasticity and retain organization in sensory deprivation. So I worked previously on the congenitally blind, and I worked with Amir Ahmedi in Israel about retention of visual cortex organization in people who are congenitally blind, and people that we've taught to use sensory substitution that translates images to sounds. And right now I'm extending that line of work with Alfonso Caramate at the psychology department here, both working on blind people, on representations of concepts which are not sensorially available in the blind, and also in another population, which is the embolic population, people born without hands or arms, that enable us to study the effects of sort of a partial sensory motor deprivation, because their visual experience is completely typical, whereas their own motor experience is very different. And just one teaser finding from the current data is that in typically developed people, they have an overlap of the preference for viewing hands and of viewing tools. And one theory was that this develops because we motorically handle tools with our hands. And we find the same overlap in people without arms. So that also obviously does not develop only from motor experience, but also from viewing these things together or from their common function. So I'm linked to the whole plasticity developmental aspects here. And thank you very much for inviting me.
Okay, great. So we'd like to make the panel discussion open to everybody, of course, and I'm sure you have many, many questions. Personally, if you have experienced synesthesia, I would love to hear your experiences, and you can state them or phrase them as a question as you wish. I think just to get everybody some time to think about what they want to ask, Daphne and I both have a question to get us started here. If I may start, then one thing that came up related to genetics and autism and synesthesia, now that we have access to large databases, as we just heard about, I'm curious to know if there's anything different about synesthesia in autistic subjects versus other non-autistic synesthetes, for example. Is there a way to track that, or is it just, as you would expect from the percentages, that color grapheme is so popular and so it's just the same? Or if that has not been studied, whether we should or could from the data that's been collected. Anybody who's...
I could start just by, I think it's the case that there's only been maybe 2 studies looking at the concordance with autism and synesthesia. So it really is very early days to say whether synesthesia looks different in people with autism or not.
maybe I'll take a stab at answering the question by asking another of Simon and asking whether, so we know now that there's a higher proportion of people who are among the autists who have synesthesia. Does the severity of autistic symptoms relate in any way to synesthesia, synesthetic perception?
Well, in our study, we didn't really have a measure of severity. We just had a case control design, and so you either have a diagnosis on the autism spectrum or not. We did have AQ, which isn't really a measure of severity, but we haven't looked at whether AQ predicts the kind of synesthesia you have. Or
I might even predict that there would be a bit of a negative relationship. So the most severely impaired kids on the spectrum probably haven't acquired many of these culturally acquired systems, like literacy, like even necessarily musical pitch, although, you know, that there are obviously exceptions to that. But as a general rule, a lot of the most severely impaired kids won't have picked up these systems. And given the prevalence of synesthesia tied to these culturally acquired systems, you might find that the synesthesia is more common in those kids who are high enough IQ and verbal enough to pick up some of these culturally acquired systems.
That's actually one reason why I was asking the question if this could be a test case to see, for example, in Rett syndrome where there's severe regression of even vision now, we know, would that be a way to parse out the components that are contributing to the synesthesia effect? I was hoping that David might have some comments on his genetics or the strategy for approaching this.
The genetics, this has been essentially the longest project I've ever taken on in my lab. We've collected a number of family trees, and synesthesia marches through the tree, and so we can do family linkage analyses. We found a hot spot on one chromosome, but what's clear is that there's not going to be a single gene that's true across families. So it's just grown quite complicated. So we're sort of right now in the muck of that. We still don't have a result of even a single gene.
So Simon, I take it in the distribution of synesthesia in the autism population you studied, there aren't enough cases to see if that distribution is the same as in the general population? Would you predict there would be more of what you've been calling the lower forms and fewer of the higher conceptual forms, or we just don't have the data to evaluate that?
it was a relatively small scale study. It was several hundred people, but I don't know whether you'd expect a different kind of distribution, different subgroups of synesthesia and autism compared to people without autism. The other thing that we haven't really talked about today, but if in autism there's a kind of a greater awareness of sensory experience, you know, people with autism notice if a t-shirt is comfortable or not, and they might want to wear the same t-shirt rather than a different t-shirt because of its tactile properties, or get very picky about their food. So they'll eat one kind of pasta but not another kind, so they're very sort of focused on sensory experience. I'm just wondering whether once you're more aware of sensory experience, does that mean that you also become more, predisposed to synesthesia?
Or more aware of the synesthesia in all of us. Could also be. Other comments on Takau's question? Well then,
one
go
question I
ahead.
could ask to maybe also further maybe tease these apart is we've mentioned a lot one of the connections between autism and synesthesia in this conversation has hinged on the hyperconnectivity in sensory regions. But in autism, the prominent theory is that we not only have hyper-local connectivity, but hypo, long-range connectivity. Have there been a series of resting state studies in synesthesia that try to look at the contribution of global and local connectivity to the symptomatology?
Yeah, so there have been a couple of resting state studies that have looked at entire global brain networks, and they don't find the global underconnectivity that is thought to be specific to autism. One thing that's come up, though, in the analysis of resting state data much more recently is, and this is especially Jonathan Power, who was working at WashU, he started to raise the issue of spurious correlations due to movement. And so anytime you have populations that are likely to move, you're going to see spuriously low long-range connectivity values and spuriously high local connectivity values coming out of these resting state scans. And this is true for 20-year-old people with autism or 4-year-old kids who are typically developing. So it is a problem that infects much of the field when we make these claims about how this is happening. The synesthesia studies that have been done have been with people who are otherwise typically developing, who are adults, and in that case we don't see the evidence. So take that dissociation with a grain of salt given the methodological issues that, like Jonathan Power has been raising.
But I guess resting state fMRI is not the only way to look at connectivity.
Absolutely, yeah.
And as far as I'm aware, there hasn't yet been a post-mortem brain study in synesthesia, although in autism the field is more mature. So there have been many. And I guess one future study which will be interesting is to see whether the kinds of differences seen in autism post-mortem studies also show up in synesthesia ones.
Yeah. So we've had this conversation amongst members of the American Synesthesia Association a couple of times where various synesthetes have volunteered their brains when they're done with them, as James Wannerton puts it. And so this would be obviously something that we as a community might want to start to lay the groundwork for now, to say how do we, and maybe people who have expertise in having done this in the autism community or in other communities, how do you even go about, for example, getting IRB approval and permission to basically take someone's brain when they're done with it?
Yeah, I mean, so brain banks are well established, including here in Harvard. And I think, often a single researcher is not going to come across enough donations of tissue. So you do really need to be working in consortia.
I'd like to change the focus, and I would like each of you to comment on what the educational implications are of synesthesia and what we know or speculate about its development. So as we teach the child to read and the brain changes, as we teach arithmetic, are there implications from what we now understand about synesthesia about how we might do that better? Ed, you study neuroeducation as well as
Yes.
synesthesia, so would you like to start off? This is the moment for wild speculation.
So I'll give you guys one example of the sorts of things that might be interesting. And then I'll also talk about some of the empirical limitations that that first idea would have. So let's say we know synesthetes report that if they have distinctive colors, I can't remember her name, but it was green. It must have been Valerie or Vivian because V's are green. And that can serve as a memory aid for them. Maybe teaching children distinctive colors would actually help them with their memory. We've also heard today that those same sorts of things can interfere. So 2 is yellow, 5 is blue, but 7 is purple. And then to make it worse, 3 and 4 are other colors, and they still somehow have to make that color for purple. So it can also get in the way. So you might think at one level, hey, perhaps teaching kids who aren't synesthetic, just using distinctive colors. So not even necessarily trying to train them, but trying to use distinctive colors might be a helpful thing. And lots of teachers do this. Lots of teachers have colored markers in their classroom. They use color coding in all sorts of different ways. That might also turn out to be a useful strategy entirely independent of synesthesia. So one of the things that we know from lots of memory literature is distinctiveness is one of the valuable factors in making things memorable. If somebody is distinct, they're the first item in the list, they're the last item in the list, they're the only one that showed up wearing a red sweater, anything that's distinctive will help to make things more memorable. And so maybe distinctiveness helps in these cases, but a teacher who's using colored markers and who has a synesthete in their classroom might also then be running into problems, creating additional difficulties for a student when it runs into those things. So there's lots of things initially that you could first start to hit on. And then as you think through it more, you go, oh, well, maybe that comes from other basic principles, or maybe that introduces other problems. So what I'd like to suggest is that, and what we've just tried to do, is put together a grant that says, hey, we need to do some of this systematically. And start to really explore this. So Jules and I, in the handbook, we had a chapter where we wrote about synesthesia in the schools, and we worked out, based on the prevalence estimates, that means that here in the United States, there are just under 1 million school children who have synesthesia, 930,000 kids in the United States with synesthesia. And most teachers, most principals, most educators don't even know about it. So that might be, for me, one of the first really pragmatic things, is just trying to raise awareness so that if there are accommodations, teachers start to do this.
If I may
Yeah.
jump in. Not that I'm very fluent in education or synesthesia, but in Israel there was a program in teaching math using small blocks, which varied in size according to the number and also had distinctive colors. Now, that was an utter disaster, and most people attribute that to the using size as a measure for numbers, but I don't know, maybe it also had to do with the colors. So if you're trying new educational programs, it might be worthwhile checking that and finding out what went wrong there.
So that sort of number bonds curriculum, Brian Butterworth has been using it to try and help kids who are struggling to learn math, because one of the things that we see in kids who are struggling to learn math is they don't understand numbers as magnitudes. So lengths is actually a very powerful way to try and convey magnitude that goes along with the symbolic numbers. But for kids who are developing typically, it might actually be too much information.
Or even confusing when you need to work with larger numbers and you don't want to use actual quantities, but you want to extrapolate to more abstract concepts.
Yeah, absolutely.
Comments from anybody else? It's about educational implications?
I've been thinking for a while, maybe, I mean, this is a bit left field, but I was wondering if synesthesia might actually be a reflection of a learning difficulty that some small percentage of the population has. So as Ed pointed to, it's easier to remember things when you tie it into some sort of other information stream. One example is it's often hard to memorize a poem, but if you're memorizing the lyrics to a song, that's easier because you've got this extra thing that you can hook it to. So all of the forms of synesthesia that I've been looking at are the colored sequences. Well, what's special about these sequences is that they're completely arbitrary things that you have to overlearn. And for kids, it's hard, right? Monday, then Tuesday, then Wednesday. There's no rhyme or reason to it. You just have to memorize it. And so something I've been wondering is, kids who are having a hard time learning that, does their brain essentially find ways to reach out and hook onto other information streams? And synesthesia is the reflection of that. I think we often tend to talk about synesthesia like it's some sort of gift, but maybe it's the opposite. Maybe it's a reflection of some bad.
In fact, I'd like to pick up on that because if you take an evolutionary sort of point of view and you think about why is it that only 4 to 5% of the population has synesthesia, it sort of suggests that perhaps this is not what evolution intended, if you will, and that it's an outlier case of as has been suggested here, of perhaps the lack of pruning and so on and so forth, and lack of inhibition. So one way to look at it, in fact, is to say these folks represent an outlier population, and therefore using the sorts of information that synesthetes possess to try to design an educational program may not be the way to go, perhaps. And this also reminds me, the first synesthesia meeting that I went to at Princeton that we were at way back when, I remember meeting a synesthete, this woman from New York who was a lawyer, and she lived in Manhattan, and I asked her, so how's it going? And it was the first time I had met a synesthete, and she said, well, actually, I stopped working. And I said, why is that? She said, because I simply could not go outside anymore. She said, when I go outside, especially in Manhattan, with the noises and the sights and the smells and all of that, it was just overwhelming for me, and I'm essentially not functioning anymore. So she became essentially a recluse, And I sort of never forgot that, because it seems to me like it could be pretty debilitating, in fact. So,
But that's not typical of synesthesia.
is that the case?
Yeah.
I mean, again, I don't know, but I just
She was an
remember.
outlier, yeah.
Really?
I think she was an outlier among outliers.
Yeah. So if I could just add to that, that I think most forms of synesthesia don't interfere with your functioning. So that maybe it's giving you an extra level of experience, but it's not interfering. But there are some forms that do. So we certainly have met people who not only see colours when they hear sounds, but also the reverse. And that, so when you're having two kinds of synesthesia, that can interfere and lead to the person wanting to just stay in very controlled environments. Not too much colour, not too much sound.
So I have to bring this up in relationship to your sort of statistical argument that if it's only 5% of the population, maybe this isn't what evolution intended. As a lefty, as somebody who is part of a 10% population, I am acutely aware of that type of argument and the possibility that that's a completely fallacious argument, that just because I am only 10% of the population does not mean that evolution intended for all of us to be right-handed.
Yeah.
In fact, there's some evidence that that would be nice. But in fact, there's even some evidence that other species, some of them have a higher rate of left-handedness. So I wouldn't want to go from statistical rarity to a particular argument of that sort.
And it's important to reiterate what we saw on the movie, that most synesthetes consider it a gift. If there's a cure that is discovered, they don't want it. It's not something they ever want to get rid of. They think it enriches their lives. They do have to develop ways of suppressing it in situations where it's maladaptive, like Piccadilly Circus or Times Square. They have to learn attentional control to dampen it down. But in everyday life, they love it. And I wish I had it.
Definitely, I'm starting to see hands in the audience too.
Sure. Just picking up on you being a lefty.
Yeah.
Nice to meet another one. And you probably know that it's 12% of males, but only 8% of females. And that Geschwind, the original hypothesis was also about prenatal steroids, was also to try to understand why left-handedness is more common in boys than girls. But if you took each of these little subgroups in the population, synesthesia 4%, autism 1%, ADHD, all the kind of different differences. One way to look at them is not that they're outliers, but rather that they are examples of neurodiversity. And this concept of neurodiversity, which I think came from the autism community themselves, is, I think, a really interesting one, that there isn't a single way that the brain gets wired up. Just like the concept of biodiversity, there isn't a single way for a plant or an animal to grow. So the same is true for brains. And that the message for education might be, if you have 20 kids in your class, don't make the assumption that they all learn in the same way, that some of them are going to be very detail-oriented, like the kids with autism. Some may be getting this multimodal experience, like the kids with synesthesia, etc.
Okay, we're going to open it up to the floor for questions or comments relevant to anybody.
There's just a comment I wanted to add. I met a woman with synesthesia she had a whole word synesthesia, and it was giving her this advantage that she was never making a spelling mistake because the word would have the wrong color. So I thought it was really interesting to see how that could be actually a help in her daily life. And she also had said that she had absolute pitch for color, that she did not need to, if she had, she wanted to match curtains with pillows, she didn't need to take a sample with her, but she would have, and that's the first time I heard about something like that, but I thought it was very interesting.
So one question that I had was whether it'd be worth, kind of basing off of what we've just been talking about, actually kind of better phenotyping synesthetes, kind of not just cross-sectionally, but also longitudinally, looking at other measures aside from kind of their actual trait of synesthesia, but also like health outcomes or other things. I mean, we were kind of alluding how there's this overlap with the autistic population. I feel like it tends to overlap in overlapping populations. So like obsessive compulsive personality disorders, tic and Tourette's, schizotypal personality types and disorder. I think it'd be interesting to kind of see how, like, what actually connects a lot of these different kind of situations together, and whether there's something beneficial to kind of understanding medically, kind of over the long term, whether there's an impact. I mean, I come from it from the medical side, where I think about things that lead to increased risk for disease or health. And I feel like seeing how some synesthetic people can use adapting to their synesthesia to kind of manage kind of their attentional kind of day-to-day activities would be something that'd be useful to see whether it actually has an impact on health.
Comment from anybody on the panel to follow up?
On the synesthesia battery, we have a very complete questionnaire about health problems, which actually was an inheritance from Ed and Rama, and we have that on. So we've got a ton of data on that. It's self-reported data. We haven't, I'm realizing now, we haven't reanalyzed that in a few years now, but when we were doing it initially, we weren't finding anything jumping out at us. We were asking about migraines and head trauma and autism, and you may remember other things. Anyway, we asked all these things, but nothing obvious was jumping out yet. But I should revisit this.
It'd be interesting to see like if there's differences in rates of like cognitive impairment over the long term, or dementia even.
Yeah, good call. We can track that.
And
There are lots of hands on the other side.
Takeo mentioned earlier about the association between epilepsy and autism, and and the relevance of that for the excitatory inhibitory theory, and whether that's also true in synesthesia.
We also have that on the questionnaire, but we didn't. I remember we found there was some rate of epilepsy self-reported, but we didn't know what the baseline rates in the population were. So we said,
all right, so this is a bit of a more abstract question. I'm a musician interested in making multisensory art, and I was wondering, do you guys think there might be emotional correlations with some of the more complex synesthetic associations? Things that are kind of common in literary symbolism and stuff, whether they get transferred over? And also, a kind of follow-up question, how would you go about creating a material or tangible representation of synesthesia, be it individualized or more generalized?
So I'll jump in on the first part about the emotional associations. And it's interesting. So one of my very slow-moving projects, Jules Simner and I have been trying to translate Théodore Flanois' book. So this was a Swiss psychologist who back in 1893 wrote a book about synesthesia, and it's in French. And Jules and I both speak and read enough French that we foolhardily said, hey, we should do this someday. And one of the things that's striking, and I can't decide whether it's encouraging or depressing, is many of the same debates that we're having now about synesthesia were being played out in 1893. And one of the hypotheses about synesthesia that was put forth all the way back in the 1890s was that it was primarily an emotional association, that it was something to do with the affective valence. So positive colors would go along with positive music, these sorts of things. Most of us in the synesthesia community have not really taken that direction, but Steve Palmer at Berkeley has recently started to move in that direction of building an argument that there are these types of affective associations, and they might be idiosyncratic. So one of his studies was to look at the association that UC Berkeley students and Stanford students had between red and blue. And Berkeley students tended to rate blue as being a better color than Stanford students did. And the Stanford Cardinal students rated red as being a better color than the Berkeley students did. So environment and all sorts of other sort of crazy things that we wouldn't necessarily take into consideration might build up a basis. He's also done this in music color associations in non-synesthetes and shown that it's mostly the affective valence that drives people's preferences. But given that people might have different affective preferences for colors, it wouldn't come out necessarily without measuring those affective preferences directly, it wouldn't come out, say, in the battery. You wouldn't see that unless you asked people about it directly. So that's part of the sort of answer to this idea about, you know, emotional linkages. Look at Steve Palmer's work, and like I said, it's a very old idea that probably is right in some sense. Probably all of these ideas that have been around for 100 years that we've been debating about have some component of truth to them, and I think that's why it's really important to think about the long developmental trajectory that it gives these windows for affect and language and meaning and shape and all of these things to get built into the neural systems that are eventually triggering the synesthesia.
Simon, did I see you about to speak?
Just to answer your comment about, you know, how do people with synesthesia express their experience through art? You could look at the website of a guy in England who's called John Adams, and he's also on Twitter. He's got Asperger's syndrome and synesthesia, and he's also a musician and a visual artist.
Yeah.
So he does a lot of, I mean, I'm sure there may be people here, other people out there who have synesthesia, and because it's a private experience, it's very difficult for the rest of us to know what it is they're experiencing, and they try to communicate it through music or through painting. So he's just one example.
I would also suggest you look at the website of Samantha Moore.
Mm-hmm.
She's a visual animator, and she's worked with Jamie Ward to make animations representing the moving colored shapes elicited by different musical notes for 6 different synesthetes. And so you have 6 idiosyncratic, dynamic animations from those 6 synesthetes. But what's interesting, and I think this gets back to the question of emotion, is when you show those animations to non-synesthetes, so you play the note and you show the animation, and you're leaving it as it was created, and the synesthete says, yeah, that's a pretty good match, or you alter the color, you alter the orientation, or you alter the direction of motion, I think was the third one. And you ask non-synesthetes now, which one is more pleasing? Which one matches the music better? They're not very accurate, but more often than you expect by chance, they picked the real one, the one that was created by the synesthete. So those synesthetic matches, despite being idiosyncratic, have some appeal to non-synesthetes. They have some positive emotional valence. And we found that recently. We had a workshop. We had a whole bunch of synesthetes make static drawings to different kinds of music. And then we played the music and showed those drawings to a new group of synesthetes. We showed them a match, and we showed them one that was for a different piece of music, and they picked out the match. So even though they'll argue, even though they'll say, your synesthesia is wrong, it doesn't match mine, there is still something appealing about a match from another synesthete compared to a mismatch that's for a different piece of music.
If I can just cut in with a really quick audio-visual request. People have requested if people can speak into the microphone from the beginning, just for the recording purposes. It would be very helpful. Thank you.
Regarding the impact of emotion for synesthesia, I would like to share my personal experience. So I believe I have 2 forms of synesthesia. One which is like the association between shapes and colors, letters and colors, numbers and colors, and between each other, like I see numbers sometimes and letters, and which is not affected by emotion, so it's very consistent for me. Instead, what I do feel personally is that my mood is strongly modulating the strength of the association between sound and colors. So that's something I experience very often. So I'm able like to draw with a given music and to draw kind of consistently repeating the same pattern, but my mood will change what I draw. And so I was wondering if by a neuroanatomical point of view and physiological point of view, these forms of synesthesia rely on different circuits. So if, for example, the basic one, the association between numbers and colors, is purely cortical, or vice versa, whereas the involvement of emotion for more complex form of synesthesia relies on the limbic circuits or basal ganglia, and if this has been studied.
So the very quick answer is it hasn't been studied enough. In fact, to date, we have no good brain imaging study of music color synesthesia that's published. There was one that I know was done in London, and it's never been published. I don't know what happened to it. So we really don't have good ideas about what's happening for music color synesthesia. Most of it has been on linguistically triggered either auditory words or letters. There is one case study of a person who had taste for musical intervals, and they looked at brain structures, so fifths and thirds were sweet and sour, these sorts of things, or maybe the other way around. But in any case, they showed that there were some cortical differences, but this is a single case study, so it didn't have a lot of opportunity. Helena Malero in Spain is the person who has been doing the most work thinking about these sort of emotionally mediated systems with brain imaging. And she's starting to really explore those sorts of aspects. So that would be the person whose work I would recommend to even start to think about some of these sorts of things. I think one of the things that in general, and this goes back to sort of David's point about the sample sizes in synesthesia studies, they typically were very small, and they are growing, but still in brain imaging studies of synesthesia, the most that we've seen are 20, 50. Ramke Rao has the largest sample in a brain imaging study. It was about 57, I think it was. So we don't have huge samples to detect, for example, small differences. And this, I think, will be a really important direction. Unfortunately, and this might be something that the panel wants to talk a little bit more about, because synesthesia isn't viewed as a problem, we're having a hard time convincing, for example, NIH that they should fund this work. So getting the funding to do large samples, you know, scan the brains of 100 synesthetes, they're like, oh yeah, that sounds like a wonderful idea, but no.
I also wonder if the occurrence of synesthesia, like if synesthesia can appear later in life as a consequence of depression, of mood disorders, so can jump up, or even Alzheimer.
Yeah. Other people want to jump in?
There have been some reported cases of synesthesia induced by injury, for example, stroke. Thalamic strokes can sometimes lead to that. I haven't heard of anything about a relationship with Alzheimer's, something like that, but you can't get it from injury.
There's also, so I mentioned in my talk a case where a person went blind and they started to experience, after their blindness, they experienced a tactile to visual synesthesia. There are also cases where the opposite has happened. So in the video, we saw a mention of the Spalding and Zangwill patient who lost his number forms after an injury in parietal cortex. And Oliver Sacks has the case of the colorblind painter where the patient was in a car accident and lost their synesthesia after an injury to color areas. They actually lost all color perception as well. So they became achromatopsic and lost their synesthesia as well as their color perception in the world.
Thank you.
Sure.
Okay, I'm going to take a question over here. It's your turn. Just give us a moment to get set up.
Okay.
There's the mic.
Hi. So I am congenitally totally blind with kind of sporadic visual experiences. And what I find most interesting about them is that they are synesthetic. And I used to think that they were just purely tactile, but what I've realized is that they get projected onto various parts of my body. So for example, if I look at like a shiny mirror, I feel like my eyes are sliding up and down it. And so that's led me to an interest in Dr. Huang's work at UCSD, and their group has studied the multisensory homunculus, and they've found alignment in visual, tactile, and auditory areas in basically are in that multisensory homunculus. So those areas respond to all three of those kinds of stimuli. So what I'm really interested in is anyone pursued the link between that, the way we map our bodies and synesthesia and in autism, because I'm curious about whether there's a hyperactivity or misalignments in those in that map that causes, for example, somebody to hear a sound and feel it on their face and then experience that stimulation as overwhelming and noxious and leading to a sense of overwhelm.
I can share something that there's a paper that just came out in Current Biology that might be of interest from Andy Bremner's lab at Goldsmiths in London, where they reported, this is with regard to the mapping question that you asked across different modalities, and they reported that 4-month-old babies, when you cross their legs and you touch them on the legs, they actually respond faster, they react faster to that than do 6-month-old babies. And the reason that they propose this happens is that by 6 months of age, babies have now mapped their visual peripersonal space and have actually attached to that map their tactile and somatosensory sensations. So it appears that some of this mapping is going on, at least in typical development, very early in life, and that prior to, say, 6 months of age, it's not there yet. So that's sort of consistent with kinds of effects that we found in the audiovisual domain as well, that many of these sorts of mappings are just emerging during infancy when the nervous system is both forming new connections as well as pruning away those that it might not need to use. So that's sort of the one thing I can share with you.
Additionally, there is also similar literature regarding people who were born blind, so that they have a different sort of mapping between, they are less interfered by crossing their legs simply because they don't map external space the same way that sighted people do. So blindness is another interfering factor, but if you're talking about a combination of synesthesia, blindness, and autism, I suspect that would lead to a very, very small population to be studied. So that would pretty much require a specific individual to step up and say, I'm both this, and that. So that's kind of hard to investigate.
Let's take a comment from the other side.
I'm interested in social cognitive development, and since we're talking about links between autism...
Could you make sure the mic is on or speak into it?
Just closer like this? Okay. So as far as social cognitive development goes, we're talking about links between autism and synesthesia. Theory of mind tasks. We know that autistic children will not typically pass the false belief task, but I would assume that people with synesthesia will have no problem with that kind of social cognitive development. What's going on there?
So maybe I'll start with this and others can jump in, but I'm not sure that there have been a lot of studies of social cognition in synesthesia. So now that there's a kind of growing interest in the overlap between autism and synesthesia, it's a natural question to ask. I think the field is wide open. You mentioned the false belief test and how kids with autism are late in developing that competence. But that assumes that you can test the individual at the right point in development. So the false belief test is typically pitched at a 4-year-old level of development. You'd have to be able to identify synesthetes at that age. There's been a bit of discussion about how reliably you can, as it were, diagnose or identify synesthesia in childhood versus adulthood. But I'm guessing, with David's website, it's mostly adults who are self-reporting their synesthesia, at which point it may be a bit late to be looking at whether social development was on track, delayed, advanced, or whatever. You could look at adult populations and start looking at social cognitive tasks, including empathy and so forth. But I think this is kind of just opening up now that we're seeing potential overlap with autism.
Maybe just to add a data point that also speaks to that question a bit, that in the general population, so non-autistic, if you give people, there have been a number of population studies administering the AQ to college students, as well as a sensory questionnaire asking how irritating are sounds to you, how irritating are flashing lights, et cetera. And those two features in life, which you would imagine develop in very different parts of the brain, very different points in development, correlate very strongly in the typical population. So the more autistic traits you have in social and communication, the more sensitive you are to aspects of the sensory environment. So that may bring a bit of hope to the idea that they're related in typical development as well as in autism, and perhaps severity in synesthesia.
Hi. So first off, thank you so much for giving this presentation. It's just really, really enriching and awesome. I found out I was multiply synesthetic when I was 19 by chance in a class, and my professor directed me toward the synesthesia battery, where I was right, which I was happy about, and I still am happy about. So thank you so much. Really helped. I was wondering from you if you found any correlation with sound to color synesthetes, any consistency there?
I can tell you something that we've been doing. So we've looked at colored notes of the scale to see if there's any pattern going on there. We looked at that a long time ago. And sort of like everything, there's no immediately obvious pattern. Everyone seems sort of idiosyncratic. I haven't returned to notes of the scale, but what I recently did was looked at chords to color synesthesia. And what we found is that essentially it's quite similar to what I presented today, which is that if I look at your C major chord versus your E diminished seventh versus your F minor, I can't guess what the colors are, but it turns out that the fingerprint of distances between them is the part that's consistent across synesthetes. So they might assign totally different colors to these things, but the distance fingerprint about which things are similar and different fall out in this very interesting way where minor chords are closer to each other in space, and then there's sort of the second axis where a C major, a C minor, and a C diminished seventh, they'll also be closer to each other. So what I'm trying to say is there's sort of a two-dimensional space of distances that gives a fingerprint of what those colors are, and then you can rotate that in color space any way you want. But anyway, that's what we found out, is that the quality of the chord, as well as the root note, maps on to what appears to be a physical map of the colors.
Wonderful. I kind of had a joint question, if that's okay. I was wondering if you have heard of Messiaen, the composer, his treatise of color, rhythm, and ornithology, and if you have any opinions on that.
So he would write music and talk about, a cascade of blue-orange chords and so on, because this was meaningful to him. What I don't know is whether that's meaningful to anyone else, whether he makes some cascade of music and thinks, oh, I nailed it because of the colors, but it may, I mean, Daphne, in relation to what you were saying earlier, your intuition, I think, would be that it would be slightly better than another combination. I don't know if I'm convinced of that.
Because I did a little bit of research on this, just cross-referencing the treatise with his piece Chronochromy, where he actually writes down his references and references back to the page numbers in the treatise. And it was sort of remarkable, the correlation. And there was also, his name is escaping me, this professor at the University of Texas who did a wonderful study where he actually recreated some of those patterns in a digital format. And what was remarkable to me, just subjectively for my unique little synesthesia, is our colors weren't similar at all, but their patterns in relation to each other were very remarkably similar.
Cool. I mean, in my opinion, that's the lesson that's emerging, is that certain things shouldn't be at all similar in color space, and certain things are close relatives in color space, and that may be the thing that synesthetes have in common, is the distances between them.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Hi, is it on? So I also have the color sequence and color sound, so it sounds like there's a few of us here. And actually, those were some of my questions, but another one is has there been any research or even anecdotal evidence that people who have those two experience different, or hear different languages differently? Because I find that, like, those two synesthesias are not separate for me personally, they're very related. And so different languages have different almost shapes, textures, color schemes. So yeah, is there anything out there about that?
So I will say that there's no systematic empirical study of this, but this is a common report that we've heard from a lot of synesthetes. So going back to the synesthesia list, the synesthesia mailing list, if you're interested, by the way, if you're synesthetic and would like to get on the mailing list, email Sean Day. And his name is spelled S-E-A-N, Sean Day, at Trident Tech. And he'll add you to the list. And he moderates the list, so you get no spam. You get only emails from other synesthetes clearly marked as being about the synesthesia list, and occasionally researchers will chime in. Most of us are pretty quiet lately on the list, mostly just listening to what people are saying. But we have heard this quite a lot. There's a synesthete in Luxembourg who, Jasmine Sinha, who has done some beautiful stuff demonstrating how, for her, languages actually have even like three-dimensional texture, and she's done this in talks by, for example, bringing in different types of yarn and showing us graphically, physically, the texture that goes along with these different languages. So this is a common thing that we have heard, but nobody's turned this into a proper, empirical study that we write up and publish. I see a hand back there, a couple of hands over there.
I know of one.
One second.
No.
I know one color letters synesthete who has a lot of desaturated letters, but they're very vivid because they move, or they got little stripy lines, or little dots appear, or the colors flip between two colors. So if you just filled out, if you just ask her to fill out the form, she says, well, it's a sort of like a pink, but then she provides this big elaborate description. Well, that's not true of the first letters of the alphabet, but later on, when there's fewer remaining colors in the color space for you to pick, because you've got 26 letters, right? So what do? Well, you want to identify, I'm making this up, but you sort of want to identify the individual letters more specifically. If you're doing this anyway, you might as well fill out so you add motions on. So I just wondered if anybody has run into this sort of thing before, or this was totally idiosyncratic?
I can jump in on that briefly, which is, so first of all, this is consistent with what I said as a speculation earlier, which is that for learning these difficult overlearned sequences, it's helpful to reach out and tag on to other things, including texture. Now, one of the sort of consistent themes in everybody's hypotheses is that this has to do with neighboring brain areas that are talking to each other a little bit more than normal. And it turns out that the letters for texture, the areas in the brain that are involved in things like texture are continuous with these areas involved in color. And so it's, in some sense, it's no surprise that people have colors associated as well as textures with these things.
Daphne, sorry.
I'm sorry, go ahead, David.
I'm fascinated by your comment about having different experiences with different languages, because I think actually one could design an experiment here that might be able to address the pruning hypothesis here. So if one were to study people who are bilingual from a very early age versus people who acquire a second language later on, I haven't thought this through yet because it just occurred to me, but perhaps one could actually parcel out which is the pruning part and which is not, and whether it's related to the synesthetic experience. I'm fascinated by this. I would love to be inside your head and know what that's like. So I'm also multilingual, and I just, I'm just fascinated by this.
There is a paper published, I agree with you about the prediction, about a woman who speaks, I believe, 8 languages, and she learned them at different times during development.
Wow.
And as you get to the later languages, more and more letters have no color at all.
Wow.
And more of the letters can be explained by generalizing based on the shape in another language. So, if a round letter like O is purple in one language, a rounded letter in a different alphabet will probably have that. And when there is no shape similarity, it's more likely there's no color. And I think that's what one would predict from a critical period pruning kind of hypothesis, that what you learn later, after the brain has changed from reading, and the hyperconnectivity has affected you as you learn to read, if you're acquiring a language with a different alphabet long after that period, you shouldn't get new synesthetic connections. They should all be based on generalization from the earlier languages.
So we need to get David to recruit a population of people who are bilinguals. And
so we're in the middle of that now, actually. We've just sent out a bunch of emails to people who have reported that they speak multiple languages, and we're analyzing
Excellent.
that. Yeah.
And are you asking them when they learned each language?
Yeah.
Right. Okay.
Great.
Yeah, actually, I'm native Japanese speaker. Like for us, even the same language, within the same language, the same character sometimes having the different pronounce, depending on the consequence and depending on the combination of the characters. So, I mean, how much you have the idea about the character and the phonemes, and we can differentiate, and how much combination is happening, even within a single language, we are happening.
Within a single what?
Within a single language.
Oh.
Yeah, we are using the same character for different pronouns.
Yeah. I can tell you, I was on a paper that looked at the at Chinese radicals in the Chinese language, and I was only on that paper because I was providing all the data, but I'm actually not expert in that area, and so I'm not even sure I remember the result on it. But but in any case, they X number of Chinese synesthetes were examined to look at this issue of where there are 2 different colors involved in the same letter, and what goes with the radical and what doesn't. I can point you to the paper, I just can't tell you the results, sorry.
There certainly is a large contextual effect, so you can take a B, separate it a little bit so it can be interpreted as a B or 13, and you set up. Okay. You can make something that can be interpreted as a B or a 13, and depending on the context of whether you set it up as a number or a letter, it will have different colors. So there certainly is a conceptual aspect to the interpretation of the shapes.
You guys described various kinds of synesthesia. I mean, so some description started from genetic basis through development and so on. From the ones that you have described, it looks to me like some of them seem to be more based on raw senses, like say pain, touch, emotion, connection to color, or taste and smell to color. And these are some of the clusters that came up in David Eagleman's data. And some of them seem to be, especially one of them, more related to cultural artifacts like letters and numerals. And I'm wondering if there is a distinction to be made between those. If the cultural ones are not of the same kind, perhaps they share features, and perhaps if you have already the other type, these cultural ones can build on it. But perhaps the cultural ones may be a learning mode in the sense that, say, David Hubbard described as say, the special region that people with expertise, say in cars or birds, have a special region that seems to be to light up when these objects of their expertise come up. Is that a distinction that you think can be validly made between these types of synesthesia?
I think that it depends a little bit on how we approach our models of synesthesia. So one of the things that's happened is that we tend to, for example, focus on a couple of types of synesthesia, draw some lessons from those types of synesthesia, and then carelessly say, hey, you know, this is how synesthesia works. And we, I think, after having run into a wall a few times and broken our noses as researchers on this, we've become more and more sensitive to this possibility that what we learn from, let's take grapheme color synesthesia, may not generalize to what we learn from music color synesthesia, or vice versa. So I think that you're exactly right to say there are certain distinctions that might be powerful for us to try and better understand it. Whether it's necessarily low level versus higher level, or whether it's perhaps within particular sensory modalities, particular sensory systems, whether that's mediated by genes or whether that's mediated by the particular brain systems that are reliably implicated. So those are all, I think, open questions that we still have a lot of work to do. And we've done a lot, and it still feels like we've barely scratched the surface.
Hi. So I'm sorry if I'm not as articulate as I could be. This is the first time I've ever been to an event like this. But I'm going to propose a conceptual jump here. In that I've heard synesthesia described by some of you as well as elsewhere, that synesthesia is a very subjective experience. It's a very personal one. But I think that if you consider some of the information that we've been looking at today, so specifically the auditory color synesthesia, and the structure, there seems to be this underlying structure which is present in many forms of auditory color synesthesia. There is something called structural objectivity. And structural objectivity was proposed by Daston and Galston in this book called Objectivity, recently came out. And so the whole idea is that I see this chair, and while I see this, no matter what my experience, my perception of this chair is going to be different from his perception, right? But the relationship between this chair and this chair are going to remain the same, no matter what. So even if I experience this chair in a very specific way, the relationship between these two chairs remain the same. And so what I'm trying to draw a connection between that and the relationship between notes and auditory color synesthesia, in that there seems to be this structure which you could call something other than subjective, something that is much more hardwired, arguably objective. And I don't know, I think I just wanted to get your guys' thoughts or feedback, just because it's something that came up while I was listening.
If I've understood this question correctly, that's what we were able to tease out of the big data was this pattern, this, let's say, a fingerprint that seems to hold across synesthetes, even while their specific colors are unique to them. What stays constant is this structure across the colors.
Do you think that structure is then something that should be pursued specifically? Like, should we be going for the understanding of those independent structures at various levels of complexity in synesthesia?
Yeah, I mean, our first guess is that what it represents is something fundamental in the neural wiring, in the circuitry itself. So something that people discover in brains all the time, wherever we look, are maps where things are laid out either by the frequency of a note or by the position on a body or whatever. You find these maps in the brain where things have some sort of logical structured relationship with one another. So our assumption is that's what's happening under the hood, and we're just measuring what comes out at the top.
So one final question here.
Hi, I just want to say thank you for all of you for this insight. I'm completely new to synesthesia, so this has really been eye-opening. I'm a music therapist, so I'm kind of just thinking about all the auditory-related topics of synesthesia, and this isn't really, part of a question. Well, first of all, what you said about intervallic relationships and their part in the synesthetic experience is extremely interesting, and I'm thinking about all types of ways to apply that into my practice. But more importantly, do any of you know of any specific research or case studies involving synesthetics who also experience some type of other neurological or psychological disorders, such as depression, or even things regarding hallucinations that aren't necessarily related to their own synesthetic experiences? Because I think, as a music therapist, I'm interested in working with patients who are experiencing such experience, whether it's depression or psychosis, and I can see if those non-synesthetic experiences start to interact with their synesthesia, it could be extremely hard in my practice. That's very, very out there and probably a very, very small percentage, something like that happening. But do you know of any type of research?
So the primary group that's been interested in links between, generally psychopathology, emotional disorders, and synesthesia is a group in Germany headed by a guy named Marcus Zedler. And in the handbook, we have a chapter where they summarize a lot of their findings. Now, for you as a therapist, this might not be extremely valuable information because what it talks about is broad demographic trends. When we look across hundreds of synesthetes and ask them about their psychological well-being, and we do things like Big Five personality inventory, there are broad patterns that they see, and then they break it down a little bit by age group and some of these sorts of things. So that may be helpful just to prepare you, but it doesn't really give you, I think, a lot of insight into how to use that information. That's still where your clinical acumen is going to have to play an important role. But if you want, of course, I have PDFs of the individual chapters. You could buy the whole book. You could also email me, and I can send you just that one chapter
Yeah, I'd
given
appreciate
your
it.
interest.
Yeah, thank you.
Sure.
All right. Cal wants to thank all the speakers because he has another question.
I have a mic. Well, I think we've heard a lot, learned a lot. There are a lot of challenges to try and make this scientific research question. How do you identify synesthesia, especially in pre-verbal children and in mice, for example? I mean, it's hard to picture right now what would be a compelling task or behavior that could be used to say, oh yes, this mouse is synesthetic. But I think we've heard a lot of different perspectives, which will help certainly give us food for thought. And I hope that this kind of meeting will launch a number of interesting collaborations. We've already had some discussions here internally. And thanks to all of you for coming and staying for a long day. I think it's really enriching to hear from all of you, and we try to give as much time as possible for this discussion, but I'm afraid we have to wrap it up. Thanks also to the AV crew and our staff, Kendall and Parazad, who made all of this happen. It's been months in the making, and I'm glad that it came off exceptionally well. So thank you all very much.